God's grace is made powerful, made significant, sufficient in our weakness. And so instead of trying to hide our weakness, it's an opportunity to embrace and celebrate God's grace and God's power.
Welcome to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Professor Paul Young-bin Kim. This podcast features conversations on the intersection of psychology, culture, and faith with renowned scholars in psychology and related fields. And now, here's Dr. Paul Young-bin Kim.
We have Dr. Kenneth T. Wang, a professor in clinical psychology at Fuller Theological Seminary here. He is a licensed psychologist in California and Illinois and a fellow of the American Psychological Association. He received his PhD in counseling psychology from Penn State University. Prior to Fuller, Kenneth taught at University of Missouri and worked as a staff psychologist at the University of Illinois and a counselor at National Donghua University in Taiwan. Kenneth's research focuses on perfectionism, psychological measurement, and cross-cultural psychological adjustment. Kenneth, so good to have you on this episode.
Yeah, thank you for having me, Paul. Really honored to be invited and to share in this platform.
Yeah, I'm really excited about our conversation today. So let me jump straight into it. I know that perfectionism is an area that I know that you've researched for a long time. And I followed your work in that area for many years now. And, the average psychology student and instructor like myself knows what perfectionism is. But I'm curious about this idea of religious perfectionism. I'm intrigued by it because I know that you've published on that topic. Could you say a bit about what religious perfectionism is and maybe give some examples?
Yeah, of course, I'm happy to. And so as a scholar, I'll get in a little bit nerdy into the different dimensions. So a little bit of framework on perfectionism. There's multi-dimensions of perfectionism. There's an adaptive part that's striving for excellence, striving for perfection. And then there's this other part that's maladaptive, and it's being overly critical of oneself. In other words, it's magnifying the imperfection and feeling like, oh, I can't stand this. Either it's perfect or it's nothing. So that's the dimensions or the structure framework of perfectionism. And in terms of religious perfectionism, it's perfectionism in the religious realm. It's for religious believers and how perfectionism is manifested in their faith. So for example, in parallel, there's one dimension based on the religious perfectionism scale that we developed. That's more of the adaptive striving part. That's the zealous dedication part, that they're very zealous about their faith, and faith leads every aspect of their life. So that's the striving part. And then also parallel, there's a critical part. That's feeling like they're never good enough. For example, a person could feel like they're never a good enough Christian, like they're not good enough in God's eyes. So that's the second dimension. So religious perfectionism is sort of like perfectionism in the religious realm, and scrupulosity is associated with religious perfectionism. In other words, scrupulosity is an excessive fear of sinning, of not getting God's approval. So it's kind of like an obsessive compulsive kind of aspect. So that's sort of a brief nutshell of religious perfectionism. And also want to add another point is for religious people, perfection can mean different things. So for example, for Christians or related faith, for example, a colleague and I, we did a study with Mormons, Latter Day Saints, and we asked them, what does it mean to be a perfect believer? And different people, they had an open question response. Different people had different response. So one of the top ones was a perfect believer is people who don't sin. That's being perfect. But of course, there's other people, other responses say that perfect believer is people who's loving, who's other focused as opposed to self-focused. And some people talked about perfect believer is in the heart, purity, as opposed to behaviors. Some say it's spiritual practice. And there's also people say that a perfect believer is unattainable. It's through Christ, through atonement, that a person is perfect. So that's also an important aspect because different Christians, different Mormons, different Buddhists, they might be striving for different thoughts or ideals of being perfect. So those are some of the elements that I think are related to religious perfectionism.
Mm. I am thinking about the two factors that you mentioned, sort of the
Mhm.
almost the adaptive side of perfectionism and
Yeah.
then the maladaptive side. Are those two things correlated when you look at the data, or should we consider those two sort of inversely correlated or non-correlated factors? The zealous and the hard striving, hard working aspect of perfectionism, and then the maladaptive, critical side of perfectionism.
Yeah. So I think it could be different in different populations. I don't have the numbers off the top of my head, but based on my general impression, they're like weakly
Mm,
positively associated. I think people who are more zealous, they care about being not good enough or they're
mm,
more critical. There is typically a positive correlation, but they're distinct, very different concepts. And also they relate to outcome variables differently.
mm,
So the self-criticism usually relates to anxiety, depression, the negative
yeah.
psychological indicators. And for the striving or the zealous, it doesn't as strongly related to
Mhm.
the negative well-being. Sometimes it's not significantly correlated or minorly negatively correlated, and it's more so correlated with some positive religiousness aspects.
Mm. Interesting. Yeah.
Mm.
So those two things as dimensions of perfectionism and including religious perfectionism might be related, but they might predict different things.
Yeah.
Mm, mm. And, I was looking over your other measures and you have several really interesting and relevant measures, but there's a perfectionism perceived from God measure. I was really intrigued by that.
Yeah.
And can you tell our listeners a bit about what you mean by that idea? Perfectionism
Yeah.
perceived from God.
Yeah. It can be a little bit confusing, I think, with the different types of perfectionism constructs. So perfectionism, there's the positive or adaptive, maladaptive parts. And there's also directionality in
Mm,
perfectionism research. Where does this perfectionism originate from? So, for example, when we talk about perfectionism in the Western realm, or when we think about perfectionism, we think about personality traits. Okay, I'm a perfectionist. I have perfectionistic standards for myself. But actually there's directionality. It could be perfectionism coming from external expectations or imposing on others, even within the perfectionism itself literature. So it's using the intersection of these perceived perfectionism from God is how do I feel that what kind of God is God?
mm,
Kind of perfectionistic God? Does God expect perfection from me? Or is God scrutinizing me in terms of all my shortcomings, all my sins, all my imperfections? So it's a different perspective. It's perfectionism, but it's how I perceive God, whether my God is a God who has perfectionistic expectations or is perfectionistically critical.
mm. And so am I gathering from your description, Kenneth, that that measure also has those two dimensions that you talk about, which is
Yeah.
one
Yeah.
is like really hardworking, striving after good outcomes, and then the other is the critical side, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think for our scale, there's God standards.
Mm,
God have high standards,
mhm,
perfectionism standards or not.
yeah.
And then there's God discrepancy,
Mm,
whether God's always looking at the gap,
mm.
discrepancy, shortcomings of me, of us.
Fascinating. Yeah. And I think about the psychology of religion literature on God image and how you perceive God and how that could also be related to what you're talking about, that we
Mhm.
internalize these images of God in a way that we might see God as more loving, more accepting, or more
Yeah.
controlling and more demanding.
Yeah. Yeah. So God concept. Yeah.
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm. If I can share a bit about my own background, I grew up
Oh, of course.
under Christian parents who are missionaries. So I grew up in the Philippines as a Korean missionary kid. And I I think I internalized a lot of the Christian messaging about perfectionism, but also my own personality and also the Korean cultural aspects related to perfectionism. All of those really impacted me in a way that I think there were times in my life where the maladaptive perfectionism was a really prominent thing, right? Where I had such sensitivity to criticism and wanting to please others and to be perfect in whatever endeavor that I was doing. And I guess I wanted to share that aspect because I know that you've also done research cross-culturally when it comes to perfectionism and
Again,
how might, like, for example, Asian cultural aspects intersect with religious perfectionism in a way that it impacts outcomes, both bad and good outcomes.
mhm. Yeah, I think you raise a good question. And I think we are impacted to a certain degree by our environment
Mm,
in terms of our perfectionism is shaped and formed by societal or environmental factors. And so I can imagine if we're growing up in a place where we're scrutinized or our shortcomings
mm,
are pointed out, or we're like a fishbowl, people watching in, we can be more sensitive to those things. So I know pastor kids, missionary kids, PK, MK, they're often in a fishbowl with the community looking at the pastors, the missionaries, and their family and their kids. And there could be a lot of self-consciousness
mhm,
around being viewed, having certain expectations, worldly, achievemently, faith-wise, etc. So I
mhm,
think that can have an impact. And I think culture has a significant impact too. I think my research has been more on East Asian culture
mhm,
that's been influenced by mainly Confucianism.
mhm,
And for Confucianism,
mm,
I don't know how to pronounce the word in English, but for that, there's a way of shaping the society and it's obligation oriented.
mhm,
There's different social roles people need to fit into. A father's need to look like a father. A son needs to look like a son, what a teacher looks like, and different roles. And so that's one of the emphasis. And another emphasis of Confucianism is improvement oriented.
mhm,
Like you self cultivate, you become better, and you identify places that you are not good enough
mm,
and to improve on that. So, based on those, a lot of times it's kind of like, okay, let's examine what we're not good at.
mhm,
And then that sort of socializes us to look at the discrepancies, look at the imperfections.
mm,
And so, one example, like a lot of Asian families, if you go home, you get a 98 on a test.
mm,
Most parents will say, oh, the 2 points that you missed. Oh, next time you can improve on that. So we're socialized to look at the imperfection. So for Asian and Asian Americans compared to European Americans, they often have higher discrepancy scores,
mm,
have higher maladaptive
mhm,
perfectionism scores. There's higher concern over mistakes,
mm.
higher parental criticism, higher doubts about actions. So we are socialized by our environment to focus on different things. And also because of that, in my process of researching perfectionism, I developed a family perfectionism construct and scales. So from an Asian perspective or a lot of collectivistic cultures, perfectionism is not just an individual thing, but
Mhm.
it's a family thing. So
Right.
for example, the tiger mom,
Mhm,
that's an example of
mhm.
a very perfectionistic family.
But as you're sharing, Kenneth, I also thought about like prominent Asian cultural values, like the work of Brian Kim and his colleagues, and how one of the prominent Asian, and for that matter, Asian American values is family recognition through achievement, which is the idea of, as you know, just having like exceptional standards be internalized.
Yeah.
And that our achievements as individuals are not just for ourselves, but that it brings honor to our families. And also, as you mentioned, if we don't achieve, it brings shame to our family, and how
Yeah.
that as a cultural value, I mean, I guess we could describe it as in and of itself kind of a neutral thing. It's a cultural value, but then like when
Mhm.
it's correlated with maladjustment and including maladaptive perfectionism, I can see how we can start to evaluate the effectiveness or the utility of those kinds of approaches. Yeah.
It's an extra layer of stress.
I really liked your analogy or metaphor of the fishbowl because that's
Hmm.
something that I could really relate to while growing up, where my parents, they were so concerned about their image as missionaries that sometimes they Yeah, they would literally tell us that we couldn't do something, not because they themselves believed that it was wrong, but because of the image, what other people thought
Yeah.
about them, about us. So yeah, I really related to what you shared there. You know, you've already touched upon this, Kenneth, but if you feel comfortable, could you share a bit more about what motivates you to research and to talk about perfectionism as a Christian scholar? And feel free to share like personal connections if you feel comfortable, or from a scholarly perspective, but specifically from a Christian perspective, what motivates you to do this kind of work?
Okay. Yeah. So I'll just start with what led me to research perfectionism. And when I was reflecting back on this question, I don't, it wasn't particularly Christian aspect,
Mm.
and it was very practical. I wanted to get into grad school. So I was looking for a PhD program, and I had minimal research experiences, and I was looking for topics that I could relate.
Mm.
And then so I saw Bob Slaney, who eventually became my advisor. He was doing perfectionism. I thought, oh, I think I can relate with that. I resonate with that, and I would enjoy studying that. And so I emailed Bob and said, I'd be happy to, do research in the Chinese population, Chinese speaking population, starting with Taiwanese students.
Mm.
And then I was very fortunate to get accepted to grad school to work with him. So that was sort of my start in terms of perfectionism. But also through that process, or even before that, I started to learn about research from a Chinese indigenous perspective. And I wanted to make it applicable to the Chinese Taiwanese population. And so that's when I thought about, the collectivistic part, the family, like you mentioned, the faith, the collective unit, how people see us. And then so I developed the family perfectionism scale.
Mm.
And also it intersects with knowing that in this collectivistic culture, there's two achievement goal orientation. One is the personal part that's autonomous, that's intrinsic. And then there's a social part that's meeting external expectations, that's based on duty. So that's sort of how I started. And of course, later on in my research, I start to connect that with Christian faith.
Mm.
And that's, I think the first time it was just looking at perfectionism among Mormons, because I had a very close colleague that worked at BYU.
Mm.
And we did that. And then we did the perceived perfectionism from God scale that paralleled the family perfectionism, but more
Mm.
God perfectionism. And then one time we just curious, like, how do people perceive a perfect believer to be like? And we put in that open-ended question. It gave us a lot of insight. So that's sort of how I got into it. But I think the more I got into it and how it relates to faith, I think perfectionism is important to Christians in our Christian faith. And I think especially how we view perfection. So when we think about perfectionism, it's more individual achievement
Mm.
or moral standards. But if we think about from a Christian perspective, God doesn't focus that much on our individual achievement or our moral standards in itself. It's not a legalistic religion, but it's more of a grace-based religion
Right.
that encourages us to focus on God, which is loving God is the top commandment. And the second commandment is to love others.
Mm.
So it's helped me to think about perfectionism, shifting away from a personal focus and focusing on God and others, and also relying on God, staying connected with God
Mhm.
and focusing on God's grace.
Mm. Mm. That's really powerful, Kenneth. It reminded me of how, as Christians, we are. I'm not a theologian, but like sanctification is something that I hear a lot about, which is we're not perfect, but we're becoming more like God in how we love
Mm.
God and love other people. And that process of sanctification, I imagine, can also be loosely described as a becoming more perfect. You know, many of my listeners are interested in teaching, especially in a faith-based context. I'm curious if you have an example of a activity or a reading or just your approach in general that encourages students to make that connection between their own faith and the topic of perfectionism. And I mean, you've already shared some ideas as well, but Do you have something that's sort of your go-to in terms of maybe like an activity or reading?
Yeah, I think one of the activities that I like is, I did it once with our lab,
Mm,
is to make a Kintsugi bowl. I don't know if you're familiar with Kintsugi. It's a Japanese art
mhm,
of repairing ceramics, repairing pottery.
mm,
And so when a bowl breaks, typically what we do is we try to glue it back together
mm,
so we don't see the cracks,
mm.
to hide it so it look as close to what it originally looked like as possible. So this is a Kintsugi.
Mm.
So this is a bowl that was broken, and you can see the cracks are glued together by the golden adhesives. So what Kintsugi highlights is that instead of trying to hide our brokenness, we highlight it with gold. And so people can see that's part of the history of this bowl. This bowl went through being broken, and it's something that we don't need to hide, but we highlight it, cherish it, value it. So in other words, value the mistakes, value the imperfections, value our, yeah, our brokenness. And so this is what I do. I think this is a way to highlight our perfection. And in terms of how I connect it to our faith, is that this is like God's grace. God's grace is made powerful, made significant, sufficient in our weakness. And so instead of trying to hide our weakness, it's an opportunity to embrace and celebrate God's grace and God's power. And so this is what I enjoy doing. And when I first learned about this, I was fascinated by it. And then I started to buy a Kintsugi kit to try it. And more recently, it's become my hobby.
Mm.
So I have made several Kintsugi bowls. I had my lab members come over for one of our year-end gatherings, and then we made Kintsugi bowls together. It was a
Wow.
fun way to embrace imperfection and also shift our focus on God's grace over our weakness.
That's really powerful. Thank you for sharing that example. I'm fascinated by that idea as well of the cracks still being there, but it's covered by this gold adhesive, right?
Yeah.
So I also want to ask a bit about your teaching in a faith-based context, because both of us share in the commonality of teaching at a Christian institution and where there's an expectation that we integrate our Christian faith into all that we do as part of our professional work on our campuses. And I know that you transitioned from a large public institution to Christian higher education now many years ago, but there was a
Yeah.
transition for you. And I think you're one of the few guests on my podcast so far who have done such a transition. I don't think you're the only one, but one of the few. Most of my guests were individuals who actually started out in Christian higher ed. So I guess I am just interested in your insights and your experiences and what that process was like for you to go from a large public institution to a setting like Fuller that is explicitly Christian.
Yeah. So I think that's been a journey
Hmm.
in terms of professional journey intersecting with my faith journey. Just to give you a little bit of background, I went to Wheaton College for my master's program.
Hmm.
So when I transitioned into psychology as a field, I wanted to be in Christian place so I could feel safe that psychology would be integrated with my Christian views. But then after that, I went back to Taiwan. I worked a couple of years and I applied for PhD programs. And then at that time, I wanted to go into a big public or secular institution. And so I did my PhD at Penn State and then later Illinois and then Missouri. And so I spent many years in secular settings, starting from Penn State and staff psychologist and then faculty at Missouri.
Right.
And when I was at Missouri, I thought I would retire there because
Mm.
that was the dream position that I had when I was a grad student.
Mm.
But Missouri was a really strong program. It had an international focus. It had some connections with Taiwan. And I admired Dr. Punky Hepner. And it was such a privilege working with him. And also the things that I do and the resources, opportunities.
Right.
Like that was what I thought. But so I never thought I would leave there. But I think I became aware that I've been compartmentalizing my faith with my work. So at work, I'm a psychologist. I think like a psychologist. I kind of just put my Christian faith
Mm.
in a box or compartmentalize it. And then on Sundays, I go to church. It's a very different world. And also in Columbia, Missouri, the church was very conservative.
Mm.
So I'm in a world that's one is very conservative and one is very liberal. And it kind of pulls from me. And I just compartmentalize those two parts. I know there's different views, different values, but it was hard. But I still went day in, day out and stuff. But I became, I feel like a little bit more distant with my faith. It was different than when I was young, that I
Right.
could more just share about my faith. And I remember Sundays, oftentimes I would have this feeling. I would look at my pastor speaking on the preaching on the podium, and I'm like, I wish I could be like him.
Mm.
I could just really talk about faith, like in my class or in what I do at work, rather than have to hide
Mm.
that part. I just had like, oh, that would be such a nice thing to be able to just talk so freely about this aspect, critical aspect to me that I've just compartmentalized.
Mm.
And then 2024, Fuller had an opening.
Mm.
So I got an email about it and I thought, wow, this looks amazing. And that opening part of the role was also to be part of China Initiative. So it would be working with the Chinese population. So I felt like I could still work
Right.
with the Chinese population, Chinese cultural heritage part, and also even more so go to China a couple times a year.
Mm.
I could still do my psychology and integrate that with my Christian faith. And so I thought it was good. I showed it to my wife. She was like, our family moved so much. They were sick and tired of moving. I felt like if I brought up anything related to moving, I just would be looked at as like torturing them. But it was so unique position that she said, oh, okay, it looks unique. She didn't say like, there's no way. But of course, through the process of moving, I know it was very, very hard for my family. There was a lot of loss, a lot of feeling like broken promises. But also I think there's the part like knowing that, okay, maybe God's leading us in this way. And in the process, for me, it wasn't an easy decision too, for having to sort of compartmentalize, hide my faith for like almost a decade.
Mm.
It wasn't easy to just say, oh, I'm going to shift my career to Fuller because it's coming out openly. Like I'm at a seminary, not just at a Christian university. And so I wondered what kind of career impact would that have on me. And I thought, okay, I'm going to consult with a few mentors that I trust and see what they think. And I thought everyone will say, no, that's not a good idea.
Mm.
So first person I consulted with was my advisor, Bob Aarons, and I talked with him and I thought he was going to say, no, it's going to derail your research trajectory and stuff. Stay at Mizzou. But when I mentioned it to him, he said, wow, this looks like a position designed uniquely for you. Oh, wow. I was surprised. He was not a Christian. And I don't think he was had a very
Right.
positive view of Christianity, but that was his response. I had his blessing
Wow.
and he said he would write letters for me. But he told me I think it would be important for you to talk to people at Missouri. Don't just go, maybe they'll want a letter there. They want to see how you're doing there and stuff. So then I brought up the courage to talk to Punky Hepner, who was someone who I was working with. He was planning to retire. And he was planning for me to success all the things that he was doing related to China, related to the Taiwanese
Yeah.
China connection with Mizzou. And so I felt like, oh, okay, that's hard because I think I'll disappoint him. So I told him. And still to this day, I just can't imagine what just the person he is. I know he was disappointed because he really, he had this vision of me taking over and stuff. But he said, Kenneth, no one's going to look out for you. You don't owe Missouri anything. Look out for yourself. If you think this is what you want, go for it. don't worry about Missouri. Don't worry about who takes over what. Your future. You need to look out for yourself. Oh, that was, and I know he said it in a way that I felt comfortable pursuing, but I know it wasn't easy.
Right.
And even he wrote a letter for me. He wrote a glowing letter. And at the end, he said, if honestly, if I end up staying at Missouri, you'd be happier. But I think just says a lot about him as a person. I was surprised the first two people I've approached. Yeah, it was an open door. And then I thought, I'm going to ask another person, and her name's Mayfin Wei. She was someone who has been mentoring me on being a productive researcher and stuff. So she's very practical, like not more like the Asian part, like, oh, we want to get tenure and you want to get this and that, as opposed to pursue what you like.
Yeah.
So I thought, okay, I'll ask her. She'll probably say something different because we've been focusing on being productive research wise. So I told her about this Fuller position in California, Pasadena. The first thing she said was like, as a Taiwanese person, I've been thinking about retirement. I think California would be such a great place to retire. You have the Asian community and stuff. I was like, wow, okay, so life is beyond academic productivity and scholarship. And there's that about our well-being and what we enjoy, our cultural heritage, our community and stuff. And she was like, wow, this is such a good opportunity. So I was surprised that all three people who I approached, none of them were Christians, that they thought this was a good move.
Yeah.
So I think then I submitted my application, went through the process, got to Fuller. It was quite an emotional journey. I remember interviewing at Fuller. We had 2 interviews. The first one was more like a typical job interview. I had experienced one of the most embarrassing part in my interview ever during that. So I felt comfortable about my teaching skills, my presentation, my research productivity and stuff. So I felt pretty confident. But at the end of the day, I went out for dinner with the dean and I think someone else. And then they asked me a question. They said, what are your thoughts about atonement? Different views of atonement. Oh, I thought, I don't know. And I don't even was quite sure I knew the word atonement exactly what. English as a second language. If you said Chinese, I would know. And I kind of first checked to make sure my understanding of atonement, the word, is what I think it was. And then, okay, it is. And I just fumbled a few things. It was so surface level, so basic, but they didn't rate me, but I felt very embarrassed. And then they asked me another question. What Christian books have you been reading recently? And your thoughts on it? And I said, no, I haven't been reading any. Yeah. So I think it was very embarrassing, but I still got called back for a second interview. And this time it was a theology exam. You're in a room with like about 10 theologians, a few psychologists, and they asked you theological questions related to Fuller's statement of faith.
Are they deep questions or more questions you can answer if you are a practicing Christian?
They're pretty deep.
Yeah.
But I think, I don't know. I think my level wasn't really high, but I think when I went into the theology exam, the person just said, just be you and stuff. And then when I went in, I just cried. I just wept. And I think I was weeping because I felt like a prodigal son. I felt like I was feeling distant from God. I was compartmentalizing my faith. But now I get to come back home to a Christian environment, to Fuller, to a seminary, to work. And I was just deeply moved and touched by how God's still welcoming me to this place. And I think maybe I cried so much. They were a little bit light on me. So they didn't drill me too much on like just in my head. I think it was more on the emotional part. So that was my process of coming back, coming to Fuller.
Yeah.
And then, of course, then it's in terms of in this new environment, teaching students who are also taking theology courses and also learning how to integrate faith into classes. And there's the reality part. And I think the reality part of coming to Fuller, I really like being able to be free to share that important aspect or exchange, discuss that Christian part in my work with colleagues, with students. I really like Fuller because it's a multi-dimensional, multi-denominational
Mhm.
setting for people with different denominations and different views
Yeah.
of certain aspects. So I think it broadened my view of Christian faith. It's not just one
Yeah.
view, but there's certain things people have different views about. And I think over the past 10 years, I think my faith and my view of psychology has been reconstructing.
Mhm.
And I really appreciate this place. I think it's a safer place to reconstruct
Yeah.
my faith as opposed to be in a place where I have to hide and compartmentalize my faith. I
Mhm.
think being able to engage, question,
Yeah.
and explore, that was really helpful.
Yeah. And even like if you were in a setting, a Christian setting that was not open to different types of Christian traditions, that would have been a different kind of a transition for you compared to
Yeah.
being at a place like Fuller, who is, I would say, like one of the leading institutions when it comes to welcoming ecumenical voices, or trying to welcome, and also living in that tension of, on one hand, being distinctively Christian, on the other hand, again, being ecumenical and welcoming diverse voices. Yeah. Wow, what a powerful testimony. I feel like I really enjoyed your story because there were places, like I would use the word, God orchestrated people in your life, like those prominent counseling psychologists that, I've only read the works of, but I know are big names, to really respond in a way that maybe helped you in your direction, that you expected them to say, don't do it, but then they were very open to the idea and maybe even encouraging you. So I really appreciate it and like that aspect of your story. And like I that the interview questions are so scary for folks. I totally get resonated with your experience. Even as someone who grew up in a Christian context, went to Christian higher ed as an undergrad, sitting down and having people ask me about my faith and about my theology. Like we don't have we don't call it a theology exam, but we basically have a committee of people, which includes a couple of theologians, that ask a series of questions. So it's kind of like a theology exam. And some of those questions can be really deep and personal and maybe even uncomfortable. But yeah, so I totally get that experience. You remember maybe fondly, but certain parts maybe not as fondly. Once you transition to Fuller, what were some helpful things in you developing your skills to do effective faith integration into classroom? Because obviously at Mizzou, you were not expected to do that. And if you did that, that would go against that setting. So at Fuller, though, I imagine that there are promotional, tenure-related things that focus on you have to do faith integration. So how did you go about developing that? Were there resources available to you, or did you have to sort of do it on your own?
Yeah, I think it's not very structured. So
Mm.
you like a checkbox, and I think different people do it in different ways. And I think initially when I came, I was looking for some guidelines, like, oh, how should I be like? What should I do in class? Or this, do people have devotionals? What are devotionals
Right.
like? And I was asking around, and then I realized that, oh, I don't think there's a set of clear ways people do it. And even integration between being a psychologist or a Christian psychologist, different, there's explicit, implicit, different
Yeah.
integrations, even taught in the integration class. So after realizing that, it was a little bit scary because I think I want a clear guideline. I want to be a good. Now I need to quickly transition from I feel like I smelled like secular and I
Mm.
really need to have a Christian smell in this environment, or people see through me like, oh, this person is an imposter. It's a fake person. But then I realized, okay, people seem to do it differently. And so I think the first part I was trying to deal with was how to do integration in the classroom. What does it look like? How's it different in the classroom at Fuller versus at Mizzou or other secular places? And so I felt like, oh, I think some people do devotionals. And so I wanted to start the class with a devotional. But I honestly, I felt like I didn't know much more than the students, or I didn't feel as connected, knowledgeable, or with the Christian language and things, readings and stuff. So I think first day of class, I just told them my story. I just told them this is how I got to Fuller. I feel like a prodigal son.
Mm.
I'm just so grateful to being embraced, accepted here. And then I shared a little devotional, but then I said, I want to invite you to share the devotionals from here on out. I'm going to give you a volunteer sheet. You can sign up. It doesn't relate to your grades. It's totally
Mhm.
volunteer, but I think you have a lot to offer. I think more so than me. And I think it would be valuable for you to share that with your colleagues and for me to hear from you as well. So I think that's how I approached devotional.
Mhm.
And also to now, that's how I still do it. And I
Mhm.
think students enjoy of being able to hear
Mm.
from their classmates, their peers. And I think there's different aspects of integrating in research. I think I started out by doing integration with psychology of religion.
Mm.
So I think it's a different integration is different than psychology of religion. It took me a few years to sort of really understand the difference, but it was more like researching Christian
Yeah.
and religious perfectionism
Mhm.
and what it looks like and stuff. So I think it started kind of that way.
Mm.
And of course, collaborating with different scholars. Joshua Nab is someone who I collaborated
Mm.
with over the years, developing Christian related skills like Christian worldview skill, Christian contentment skill, Christian gratitude skill, communion with God skill. So now that was more like integrating in research.
Mm.
And in terms of the class, I teach stats.
Mm.
So it's not as much of integration as opposed to, for example, if I was teaching a clinical kind of class. But I think the devotional part is kind of our integration and sometimes utilizing articles that are integration in nature that
Yeah.
uses ANOVA for them to kind of read and stuff. That's sort of
Yeah.
my integration. And then I think another part is I learned I can just be me
Mm.
and be my Christian psychologist me and Kenneth me in terms of how I interact with students. And I think that is in itself is also integrating, modeling what it was like in a person. So sometimes I learn from students that it's just how I interact with them that they appreciate. I'm not thinking integration. So those are the different things that come to mind think about integration while I'm a puller.
Yeah.
And more recently, I think one thing we've been doing is we started a campus voice or student voices poll at Fuller that was inspired by Lynette Bicus
Mm.
doing student voices at SPU.
Yeah.
And some students came to me and said, "Hey, they're doing this. Can we do this?" So I kind of, was their advisor in that process of polling the Fuller student population and then eventually presenting that to the senior leadership, administration, faculty, students, and also board of trustees and stuff. We'll also see that as an aspect of just policy related, administrative related, and culture related integration.
Can I ask for the Voices of Campus survey? What are the themes that survey is capturing? What aspects are the questions getting at?
Yeah, so I think there's many questions that we ask. I think mainly we're wanting to get a sense of our Fuller students' view of LGBTQ people and in the context of Christian faith. So we ask some questions that are linked to which side you're on. I don't know if you're familiar with the four sides: side A, side B, side X, side Y.
Hmm.
So side A is being affirming. Side B is accepting that LGBT people, but also still viewing LGBTQ sexual behaviors as sin.
Mm.
And then side X is like the ex gay community that emphasize changing.
Got it.
And then side Y is between X and B. And it's kind of like they see LGBTQ individuals, the identity as a sin. They see that being a Christian and being LGBTQ, being queer is not congruent, but they don't enforce change.
Got it.
So those are the four different sides. So we kind of ask questions related, like, do you think God blesses same-sex marriage? Do you think being LGBTQ in itself is a sin, or same-sex attractions is a sin, or is identity congruent? And do you think change is the optimal way to go about it? And so we kind of did that and then looked at where students are. And like, okay, this is how many percentage people who embrace a side A perspective, how many embrace a B, and then what we found was interesting that the School of Psychology and Therapy is very different than the School of Missions and Theology. So the School of Psychology and Theology and MFT, the predominantly voice was more on the side A part. So people who were side A felt safer in class in terms of in sharing their views or feel like their views were more accepted by their peers. And in contrast, side B was larger and XY relatively larger than the School of Psychology and Theology. So in the SMT, in the School of Mission and Theology, side B was a more predominant voice. And side A folks who were affirming felt that it was less safer or their views were less welcome in classroom settings, etc. So there was a difference. We learned that there's a difference between the two schools. We also learned how diverse our community is. I think certain people thought everyone thought the same way, but clearly it wasn't. And then we also asked people about their views about community standards and whether they think they support the community, agree with the community standards, and whether they support enforcing the community standards and stuff. So that was the gist of it. And we also had a lot of open questions because we thought a lot of people's thoughts can't be captured by the 4 multiple choice answers. And surprisingly, we found a lot of people sharing open questions like, oh, actually, I think this way, not that, not that. There was a lot of engagement and a lot of voices heard in the open-ended questions. And also it was good to also have queer students. We have a total of 58 queer students who participated and hear their voice of what it's like being on the Fuller campus. So we're in the process of analyzing that. And our team, one student will be presenting at CAPS, the Christian Association of Psychological Sciences, this March. So
such important work. I'm so glad to hear that you're doing that and really interested in the themes that might come out from not only the quantitative, but the qualitative data that you're referring to. I hope that the work that you're doing will lead to some advocacy that is meaningful for the Fuller community. I have, Kenneth, a few questions that I ask all my guests. Some are more lighthearted, others are maybe a little deeper, but my first question that I ask all guests is, what is one thing that you're working on right now that is really exciting? Something that is you just want to share because it's so scintillating. You want to share with my listeners.
Yeah. So I'm on sabbatical now.
Oh,
So
congrats.
yeah, so it's been really nice. I'm really grateful to have this abundance of time compared to when I wasn't on sabbatical. And during this year, I've been trying to explore different things. And of course, I'm doing my research. I'm seeing some clients on the side. But one thing I'm working on or exploring is the idea of coaching. So like life coaching, kind of coaching. I think I've come to understand, realize myself that based on my personality, part of it is perfectionism and stuff. I like more structure, more predictability than unexpected crisis and stuff. So I think I'm working on packaging my knowledge about perfectionism into a coaching package that can be more structured. That's different from therapy. That's like, okay, we have structures, 6 sessions and stuff, and we talk about different aspects. Yeah. So that's what I'm working on. It's not directly related to my Fuller work, but I think it's related to exploring different part of how I can contribute my knowledge to the world in a different way.
No, and it is, but very related to the research that you've done, right? And also, I feel like it's exciting to think about potential like dissemination on technology, like app or something like that, where, like you mentioned, a structured intervention for perfectionism, for example, in a way that more aligns with the idea of coaching rather than a psychotherapy session. I think that sounds really cool. Yeah. If you had one advice for an advanced graduate student or a new faculty member who is interested in Christian higher ed, what might it be? And again, what you've shared in terms of your story transitioning is full of good advice. But if you could share just one concrete advice for someone who's thinking about Christian higher ed, specifically as faculty, what might it be?
Yeah, I would say, I think there's two parts of it. I think in terms of the Christian part, I would say, like what I mentioned, be yourself.
Mm.
I think don't feel like you need to fit in a certain box
Mhm.
of it has to be this way. Of course, we have to work under the institutional policies, guidelines, and tenure structure, but I think allow room to explore yourself and what it's like, integration is like for you. And it can look very different for each different individual. And yeah, and I think it's a oftentimes when I'm at Fuller, I feel very grateful to have this opportunity to train future Christian therapists, future Christian psychologists, and to be part of that journey and to have access to them. I
Right.
think in the secular world, I realized how hard it was to identify Christian colleagues. It was when told people that I was going to Fuller, my colleagues, oh, you're a Christian? I'm a Christian too, like kind of like secretly on the side. And
Right.
so I think being at a Christian place gives us access to
Mm.
be part of a Christian psychologist, Christian therapist journey. And I think that's such a blessing.
Yeah. Very well put. And then my final question is, without knowing who my next guest will be, because I don't know yet, what question might you ask my next guest? It can be any question. And if you're wondering about my last guest question directed to you is, what is saving your life right now? You can answer that question or you can pose a new question for my next guest.
Okay. So I'll answer the first question,
Mhm.
like the question from the last guest. I think one thing that when you shared about this question, I thought, what's saving my life? I would say Kintsugi. Of course, I don't think I'm under like a lot of stress. I'm on
Mm.
sabbatical, but I've seen this as a coping mechanism.
Mm.
And just an example, I'm a fanatic sports fan. And I
Mm.
love the Dallas Cowboys. I'm
Oh,
an NFL fan. And
I'm
they just
sorry.
lost.
This was a
They
hard
got
year. Yeah. Hmm.
yeah, they the hopes were high. People thought
Mm.
this was and they got destroyed by the Packers in the first round, and
Mhm.
no one saw that coming. And I think I was prepping myself. Okay, if they lose, what I'm gonna do. So
Mhm.
I had prep different coping mechanisms, and one was my bowl, my Kintsugi Bowl. So this is when I see this in the future, I'll remember this was the bowl that I made
Yeah.
to cope with the loss of that playoff game.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Mm.
and in terms of next question, I think what I would be curious is what's a new perspective, a new view, or a new belief that has changed recently for the person. I think a lot of times our beliefs, we have it for a long time or something. And then I really recently realized that sometimes it's interesting who our beliefs change. And I'm curious what has changed for them recently.
That's a really good one. Yeah. I'll be sure to post that to the person when I have that opportunity next. So thank you so much. Kenneth, it's been such an amazing conversation. I'm wondering, do you have anything else you would like to add before we wrap up our time today?
Yeah. I think I'll share a few verses,
Mm.
biblical verses that I thought connected with perfectionists. I know, like when I talked about it, it was more my own words, but I think the actual verses are what's what really touches me and that's powerful. And so I'll share a few of these that I really like. I think one is from 2 Corinthians 12, verses 9 to 10. God says, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. And Paul says, therefore I will boast all the more gladly about my weakness, so that Christ's power may rest on me. That is why, for Christ's sake, I delight in weakness, in insults, in hardships, in persecutions, in difficulties. For when I am weak, then I am strong.
Amen.
Yeah, I thought that was powerful. I link that with Kintsugi, link that with perfectionism, link that with God's grace.
Thank you. Yeah. What a powerful reminder of God's grace and how His grace is sufficient.
Thank you for listening to the Cross Cultural Psych podcast with Dr. Paul Youngbin Kim. We hope this content was meaningful. If you enjoyed the podcast, we invite you to write a review on Apple Podcasts and Spotify. Also, let us know what you'd like to see covered in future episodes. We hope you'll join us next time.
Yeah. And by the way, Kenneth, you'll see my puppy jumping up and down in the background. So I hope that it doesn't distract
Yeah, I
you.
did. Oh,
We'll
no,
just we'll just roll with it.
it's
Yeah.
nice. Yeah,
She makes an appearance from time to time.